podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone, dear listeners, to our podcast episode today. I focus on the typical areas of development for leaders and want to get straight to the point, so we can also draw strategic conclusions from them. There will be a brief introduction, then I'll get to the main. The main part is about worldview, because when we look at the value matrix, at profiling values, we first consider the external value space. And there, I address the typical areas for development. And then in the second part, it's about self-perception, evaluating within one's own skin, so to speak. I'll also touch on aspects that go beyond that, the individual scales in the value spaces, and point out one thing or another from the expert legend as well, and try to draw a conclusion. All right, let's dive into the problem outline. The profiling values method provides a flood of information. Altogether, the algorithm produces 165 scores if you take a look at it. That's quite a lot. The variability with this method is basically endless. If we look at the math, it's 4 times 18. Terms and statements. When it comes to ranking, we have 4 times 18 factorial possibilities, so that's 4 times 6.4 quadrillion. So we're talking about a 17-digit number here. That's quite something. And of course, over the years, I've seen thousands of profilings and had many conversations, which is also a lot of fun. So every day comes with a feedback conversation that creates value. A profiling is really something great. Of course, I also come across some funny and odd characters from time to time, so to speak, but many people actually have very similar areas for development, and that's why I thought it would be good to talk about what the typical areas are, or rather. I often set up a kind of bipolar axis, where you say the trait leans in one direction or the other, and accordingly, if you tend strongly in one direction, it's actually quite good, not necessarily countermeasures, but certain balancing actions, to broaden your behavioral repertoire. And now, let's take a look at a few stories about that. So, I think it's worth systematizing this. Let's first take a look at the world together. Our outward perspective, with empathy, practical and structured thinking, as most of you here know, there are many of us. Certified users of profiling values. And I'll start with empathy. What's a typical area? And this is another example of a bipolar axis that I'm setting up right now. On one side, there are people who have a very strong sense of justice. There are also a few items that contribute to this, which is of course very good if fairness is an important value, so if you bristle right away when things get unfair. On the other hand, and this is always two sides of the same coin when it comes to personality traits and characteristics, you might end up lumping others together too quickly and not paying enough attention to the uniqueness of the individual. So, their unique set of talents, and maybe also their feelings and emotions. Individual achievements, personal creativity, and so on, those things can end up being neglected. So, on one side, we have people who tend to lean heavily towards the collective side of things, let's say, in their usual way of operating. We need to advise them to focus a bit more on the individual again. And then there are others who tend to lean very strongly towards the individual side of this bipolar axis. And to them, we have to say, look, it's not all just about the individual. We also need the group, this team orientation, and with that, a focus on collective achievement as well. Another important point when it comes to empathy is that the dark, or rather the negative sides of other people, are sometimes not recognized clearly enough. So the positive aspects are recognized quite clearly, but the negative ones are not. This often leads to overly positive assessments of other people, and as a result, there's often a greater tendency to be taken advantage of. And then there's disappointment when that becomes apparent. And you get the feeling, I'm too good for this world, everyone takes advantage of me, I take on everything for everyone else, but I think far too little about myself. And that's an important point we need to address when it comes to empathy. If I'm too focused on others and doing things for others, then I end up neglecting myself, not paying enough attention to my own needs and not moving forward, which again points to the balance system in our six-part Ambrix. And then, when it comes to empathy, there's a third point I'd like to address here. When negative experiences weigh you down, when you've actually experienced interpersonal disappointments and your trust in other people becomes limited. And that's something you need to watch out for, so that it doesn't lead to bitterness. And I'm talking here specifically about areas of development for leaders. Of course, many of these areas also apply to everyone else, not just to people in leadership roles. But as leaders, we always have to extend that initial trust, even though we know it can sometimes be disappointed. We can't allow ourselves to become bitter because of it. And maybe one last point when it comes to empathy. Another area you could also call a field for development. What's the foundation? That people often handle different areas of life in very different ways. So, for example, they separate their professional and personal lives to some extent in the way they act. To put it bluntly, sometimes people leave their true personality at the office coat rack like a hat and are no longer themselves. And of course, that's a challenge for leaders, to lead my people inclusively. That means that they can really contribute as they are, and not just be a kind of shortcut or a limited version of themselves. I'll jump right over to practical thinking now. What are the points there? What stands out as typical areas for development? For one, we have here the desire to feel fulfilled by one's professional role, which is, of course, a wonderful thing. I often say to people, you want to be able to feel passionate about what you do. And that's obviously great, because then the passion comes from within, it's there, and so on. But it also makes you vulnerable and sometimes makes it harder to maintain professional distance from work matters, so it can really hurt. Especially when things aren't going so well. And things don't always go well at work. So you need to be careful here too. And the opposite is, if we look at it as a bipolar axis again, an exaggerated sense of duty. So they don't allow themselves any joy or time for fulfillment, while others don't even want to leave their comfort zone anymore. That's when people with an exaggerated sense of duty really get going, even if it really hurts. Even when it causes pain. And that can also lead to being overly rigid or stubborn, or to being uptight. So I hope I'm making myself somewhat clear when I always, or mostly, open things up in two directions. What's another point that comes into play with practical thinking, but already overlaps a bit with structured thinking? When people have relatively little focus on standardizations, on automations or scaling, and basically want to add the final touch everywhere to exceed expectations. And that can also lead to perfectionism. Result in that. That can also simply be too much in the end, maybe even teaching your clients the wrong habits, so to speak, in that direction, because you always give more than you actually need to. And then you also don't manage to optimize for efficiency, because a lot can be done in a standardized and automated way. It's really amazing what AI can do these days and how it makes things easier for us. I now use it daily in all sorts of applications. And maybe one more point about practical thinking. Too much caution, too little proactivity is sometimes an issue. This hesitancy is something we usually see when practical thinking scores low. And the other way around, when the driver score, as we call it, is 75 or higher, so when the focus on practical thinking is very, very high, then it can happen that you react too quickly as well. So again, two sides of the same coin here. I'll jump straight into structured thinking now. What often stands out there? For me, a typical area for development is that entrepreneurial thinking isn't pronounced enough. That means, in other words, that the cost-benefit ratio isn't given enough consideration. You might look at your own task very, very closely, but often you don't follow through to see your contribution in the value chain, so you don't check whether it's actually proportionate. So that would be an important point. Then, there's also not enough focus on structures and processes. This is somewhat related to what I mentioned earlier about standardization and automation, but it's even clearer when it comes to being able to work through things in an organized way. That's also a skill that you need to develop to create structure and process for yourself, even if it's just for this project, to keep a good eye on things. Sometimes that's a bit lacking. And now, another very important point when it comes to structured thinking. If this is weaker, it often means that not enough strategic perspectives are being considered. What does that mean? A strategic perspective can mean a lot of things. One thing, for example, is that things aren't thought through to the end, or there's not enough conceptualization. This is about thinking things through to the end with foresight. But that's only one aspect. Another is that taking on strategic perspectives also means not just getting caught up in day-to-day tasks with people, but also actively advancing your own personal positioning within the company. By that, I don't mean spending all day on self-marketing, but it still means do good work and talk about it appropriately. Talk about it. Here, politics and diplomacy also play a very important role when it comes to positioning yourself within the company. And that's, first and foremost, a good thing. It's a very, very good thing, as long as it's proportionate, it's done with integrity, and it serves a good purpose. And I have to say, just because politicians often set a bad example for us, that doesn't mean we don't need politics. Every human organization needs politics to organize majorities, to exert influence, to convince people. And if you've positioned yourself well within the company, then usually you have influence beyond your formal role as well. You have influence and your voice is heard. And that's exactly the goal. Of course, it's basically your duty to perform this role to the best of your ability. But then there's the icing on the cake, and that's positioning. And especially people who are still fairly new to working life tend to neglect that. Or sometimes they have certain beliefs about it, like politics. No, I don't want to, I can't, and I won't do that. But from a certain level on, it's essential. That's why I want to point this out here. Positioning yourself within the company, having a strategic perspective, it's a typical area for development. What's another aspect of structured thinking? We have a lot of people who have a very, very strong desire for freedom. That can often be turned against them. So to speak, it's something that can be pointed out to them directly. This also means that it can be difficult for them to fit into larger organizations. I also work a lot with coaches, consultants, trainers, and solo self-employed people. And they're simply wired differently than corporate folks. I also deal a lot with people in large insurance companies, banks, and generally in big corporations. That means you also have to be able to choose the right work environment for yourself. And it's not uncommon for me to tell someone, in my opinion, you're in the wrong context, in the wrong environment. You need a smaller company, or conversely, you need larger structures. And when it comes to structured thinking, another aspect is to what extent people have unconventional ways of thinking, which might be good for change, but in some companies can't realistically be put to use. So, you really have to look at this, and also be willing to leave the beaten path. Maybe I'm too conservative, too conventional. Or, on the other hand, do I turn over every stone so much that in the end, nothing is left standing? And then, of course, that can lead to chaos. So, just a quick note across the scales. Often, there are a few items related to this as well. In our profiling, topics like innovation, technology, and the great products that can result from them are addressed. These are mentioned. And many people really put a strong emphasis on that. And of course, you can definitely call that progressive. That's a good thing, too, but there are always two sides to every coin. Then it can happen that the human aspect, and even the individual person, as I mentioned earlier, can end up taking a back seat. So here, it's about finding the balance between structured, systemic values, the practical ones, but above all, the human ones as well. That sums it up quickly for the worldview. And I'll jump right into the self-perception. What typical areas for development do we have there? And of course, that brings us straight to our own needs. There are definitely some strong tendencies, one way or the other. So, we're right back to bipolarity. On the one hand, there's a lack of self-esteem and self-appreciation. Here, you have to differentiate whether that's generally the case or maybe just temporary at the moment. If we only have one measurement, it's not that easy to tell. That means, in conversation, we ultimately have to find out what someone usually does, whether it's just a temporary downturn or if there's generally a lack of self-confidence. And that, of course, brings me to the counterpart, to the other point, namely, having an inflated sense of self-worth and, as a result, a lack of critical self-reflection. And bringing up the topic of critical self-reflection is never that easy either, because it's something that's socially desirable. That people critically reflect on themselves. And now, honestly, dear listeners, have you ever asked someone how critically self-reflective they consider themselves to be? And they replied, no, I'm not critically self-reflective at all. Well, I've never heard anyone say that. Everyone thinks they're super self-critical and reflective. Maybe not always super, but at least critically self-reflective. And that's just simply not always the case. And if I have a very strong sense of self as a person, feel secure and grounded in the world, which we'll come back to in a moment, then I don't constantly struggle with self-doubt and have to force myself, even despite my self-confidence, to critically question myself. This often shows up in our own needs as well. We even have an item about it, that people feel stressed. And, stress is actually a very subjective variable. But basically, there are two aspects. First of all, you can definitely anticipate stress and organize things in such a way that it occurs less often. So, practically speaking, structuring or stabilizing things to minimize the amount of stress. But you'll never be able to completely eliminate stress because it often comes unexpectedly. Or it's not anticipated. Then comes, and that's when it really becomes a very subjective variable. So, questioning yourself, what does stress actually do to me? There are all sorts of different coping strategies. That's why I often advise managers to really engage with the topic of stress and how they themselves react to it. Another point is interesting. People often hold the world, and sometimes themselves, but more often the world and society, to very high standards. They then project these standards onto others and onto society. Sometimes, this is done in an idealistic way, which leads them to struggle with the world. Things are supposed to go a certain way, but that's not how they actually go. But that doesn't help anyone, because then you end up in the circle of concern, that is, thinking about everything that's going on in the world, instead of focusing on your own sphere of influence, your circle of influence. So this struggling with the world, if you do it at all, please keep it very, very brief, and you often have to pull people away from that. Bring them back into their own sphere of influence, where they can actually make a difference. Looking at this once again, we have a bit of a distinctly polarized and contrasting situation here. Either there's a very strong sense of being deeply and firmly anchored in the world, which is usually intimately associated with the feeling of being in the right place in life, or being on a particularly good path. But then, it can also happen that there's not enough critical self-reflection, as I just briefly mentioned. Or, on the other hand, feeling a bit lost in the world and having the sense that you're not really gaining traction or contributing to your life path the way you'd like to. And of course, temporary factors can also play a role here, for example, in this item. Specifically, as I feel comfortable with myself. This can go so far that someone rates this lower simply because, at the moment, they feel completely overweight. Of course, there can also be entirely different factors at play. So, these temporary factors are especially important when working in the context of assessments or when it comes to filling positions, because people usually have reasons for wanting to change when they apply for something or run for a position. And you often see this reflected in such items and in the scales for personal needs, achievement orientation, and also goal orientation. And that brings me directly to our scale of achievement orientation. In other words, the fundamental question, who am I myself? What is my function, my role? How do I lead it to success? And here, we often encounter this point of professional or committed attitude towards work, either too little or too much. When it's extremely high, this professional, committed attitude, then it's often still superficial if that deeper, emotional connection isn't really there. When these items come up, like I love my function, my role, or my work, or conversely, I hate it, if those drop down significantly. So here, we differentiate between a more superficial, professional, committed connection to work and a deeper, emotional one. And that's often where things fall short, with the latter. When you bring it up, people might even say, yeah, I love my husband, or I love my wife. But then I have to say, well, it's not about not loving your spouse, but you can also develop a strong emotional, even loving, connection to your job, which can then become a true calling. What happens often? An important point is that the context conditions aren't right, the circumstances. And that really shows quite clearly. A willingness to change jobs, for example, if someone feels a lack of appreciation at work. And of course, you have to look at that in a nuanced way. Ask further questions, because it's not the items or statements themselves that rank each other, but the person is the one who ranks and sorts these statements. That's why we always have to put ourselves in their shoes and ask, is it really justified to judge these environmental and contextual factors so negatively? Or maybe, as a candidate or participant in the profiling, do I actually have expectations that are way too high? So, even there, it's important to take a closer look and see, is the attitude towards work, the position, or the role really an area for development, or is it actually a driving force? If that's really, really good, then you also serve as a role model, which is an important leadership quality. What we often see as well is this kind of bipolarity that almost seems to follow us everywhere. On the one hand, there's a fighter culture saying, no, I'm not going to blame others, I'm not going to blame the circumstances, I want to succeed. And on the other hand, there's this frustration and tolerance, just accepting that it's frustrating and then tending, maybe too late, to raise your hand and say, hey folks, we need to change something here. So there's also an important point here to pay attention to this and identify areas for development. Finally, the expectation of self-efficacy. These are two items that contribute very specifically to this, especially when they're set very high. Then it leads to what's called a CIP. That's my metaphor here, continuous improvement process. That's a lean management method, mostly used in the technical industry. But I see it as a CIP gene, something inside a person, when someone always wants to improve, wants to understand better what they're doing, wants to get better at it, wants to get the best performance out of themselves. And people are often not even aware of it, because they've been going through life like this all along. But this CIP gene isn't actually that widespread in society, and that can lead to projecting the very high standards you set for yourself onto others. And that, in turn, can lead to disappointment. Quickly, just a word on goal orientation. The question here is, can I contribute to the bigger picture or not? It's also important here to recognize interactions to see whether someone feels that way, whether they're gaining traction. There are often some idealistic thoughts involved as well. Again, the idea of projection comes up, as I already mentioned. Within goal orientation, we also have a few items that can indicate whether there are issues, perhaps in non-professional areas of life, or if there's a lack of alignment in one's overall life strategy. We have four main areas of life: family, partnership, as the closest, then work. As the second, then third is social integration, friends, acquaintances, and finally hobbies or special interests. And our task is, I've mentioned this in one way or another in other episodes, to bring these into alignment, which isn't always so easy. Another point. When it comes to being goal-oriented, people seek fulfillment in their professional life, which can sometimes even lead to over-identification with their job. In other words, alignment isn't always guaranteed, or sometimes it just isn't there. That means the job might play a secondary role. So that also points towards alignment. And then we have another item that shows this. Positivity. Or not, when it comes to the world in general. Right now, I have to be honest, we're seeing a bit of a dip here because of the geopolitical situation. This item has slipped down a bit, and unfortunately, positivity currently has a somewhat lower value. If I briefly reflect on all aspects of the self, yes, if the self is too strong compared to the outside world, then there's a risk of projection. Drawing conclusions about others based on oneself was just discussed, and then the world might hit you in the face because it's not the way you thought it would be. If I'm too weak on the inside, then I'm unstable from within. The value system is then not in balance, and I'm not able to put my horsepower on the road, so to speak, in the outside world. And a wide gap within the self, maybe to mention as well, a not-so-good self-assessment, which often happens especially in situations of change. But then it's only temporary in nature. Maybe just quickly, a few more aspects that often pop up with the expert legend. Again, it's a bipolar axis. Some people should think more outside the box, be more open to change and think laterally. We call it lateral thinking for changemakers. Or, on the other hand, you might be more of a realist, an optimizer. It's about looking at where you stand on this bipolar axis and then saying, hey, let's broaden our behavioral repertoire. Also, try looking a bit in the other direction. Then, an important point, also, concentration when it comes to problem solving. So, as opposed to trying to do too much at once, this is about focus and setting priorities. Many people are gifted, talented, well-intentioned, all of that, but they end up doing way too much. It's important to consciously consider, in many situations, what not to do in order to increase your effectiveness and improve your leverage. And judgment is also an aspect that comes up again and again with the expert legend. When people are really good at this, they might tend to be a bit too dry for others at times. There are often areas for development here as well. So, what's my conclusion? Every scale, I've now gone through all 6, has one or more development recommendations. That also depends a lot on the items. In our process, too, it's all connected. And there are really about a handful of standards, but the key is to package them individually. So, among the many points I've mentioned, there are about 6, 7, or 8 that come up all the time. And it's important to have a few tips on how to make progress in these areas. And the reason why my title includes strategic conclusions is because it's worth considering how I can cluster these things. Which areas for development come up again and again? And when I look at that, you could approach leadership development in a much more strategic way, thinking much more carefully about which areas should really be addressed for everyone in order to move people forward. And here, we're definitely talking about the empathetic side, the interpersonal aspect, making sure that doesn't get neglected. That there's a balanced perspective between the team, the group, the collective, and on the other hand, the individual, that we bring passion into what we do, and in doing so, also foster emotional identification. Of course, that's sometimes lacking as well. Above all, the strategic perspective, or rather, the strategic perspectives, are a constant topic. Then we have the whole topic of self-esteem. Precisely it can swing in different directions. And then, of course, the actual identification with the role. So, when it comes to practical thinking, we have things like, what are my expectations, my standards, what would I like? And then, when it comes to being success-oriented, we look at the question, so, how are things right now? And that's why the role is often in focus, to say, hey, adjust your role a bit. Look at it with your head, pay attention strategically, and look at it with your hands. Am I really doing the right thing there? Am I setting enough boundaries? And if I look at it with my heart, is there even the kind of culture and atmosphere that lets me connect emotionally? And finally, goal orientation, looking at this, life strategy, alignment of different areas of life, long-term issues. So, to sum up, there are a few areas that keep coming up again and again. And if I draw strategic conclusions from that, we could, in leadership development, and this is how I like to do it in my projects, often form clusters where we can move people forward easily and as a group. Thank you very much for your valuable time. And we're happy to receive any feedback. And I'm already looking forward to the next episodes.